Good morning, and apologies for the delay. I thought I was waiting for someone, and apparently I'm not. So we'll get going here. I will call the Joint Subcommittee on K-12 Higher Ed and CIP to order, and will the committee secretary please call the roll?
Assemblywoman Howdigi. Assemblywoman Kasama. Here. Assemblywoman Miller. I'm sorry, Assemblyman Miller. Assemblywoman Monroe Marino. Assemblywoman Monroe Marino. Assemblyman O'Neill. Here. Assemblywoman Peters. Here. Assemblyman Yeager. Senator Canizaro. Senator Neal. Here. Senator Severs-Gansert. Here. Senator Titus. Here. Assemblywoman Backus. Present. Chair Dondero Loop.
Thank you very much, and please mark those that are not here present as they arrive. We have a lot of people in and out for bill hearings, so if you see people not here, they may be showing up in a few minutes. Please remember to silence your cell phones, and public comment will be at the end of our session today. So today we have budget work session on K-12 education funding. As a reminder, the subcommittee members, the goal of the budget work session is to provide fiscal staff with direction in preparing our budget closings, which will take place over the next 5 to 6 weeks. The Fiscal Analyst Division's K-12 education team is here to present, and we appreciate all your work. Mr. Drost, Ms. Ryan, and Ms. Camacho, and please begin when you are ready. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madam, and good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. As indicated, my name is Adam Drost, and I serve in the Fiscal Analysis Division along with my colleagues Madison Ryan and Liliana Camacho Polco, and we comprise the K-12 team in the Fiscal Analysis Division. Today we'll be working on a work session for the Nevada Department of Education, and we'll be discussing the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan as well as State Special Education Program. As a reminder, the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan is the formula by which the state provides funding for K-12 education, and this replaced the former Nevada Plan funding formula beginning just last fiscal year 2022. During the budget hearing for the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan on March 1st, members of the subcommittee discussed various items that were recommended by the governor, and this included the revenue recommended to be provided to the plan, the calculation of the statewide base per pupil funding amount, the Nevada Cost of Education Index adjustment, transportation for charter schools, and other issues. Some of these issues relate to the recommendations by the governor, while other issues relate to policy decisions, as the relatively new plan will be budgeted and administrated for only its second biennium. During the budget hearing, the Pupil-Centered Funding Account, it was indicated that it differs from any other budget for the state in that it's a revenue-based funding model, whereby available revenue rather than projected expenditures determine the funding provided for K-12 education. For the governor's recommended plan in December 2022, a consensus forecast for revenue was determined by the Fiscal Analysis Division in conjunction with the governor's finance office to develop the consensus revenue forecast for the plan. That consensus forecast will be updated again in May 2023, and those revenue forecasts will be used for the legislatively approved budget. So that will be a change that will be brought forward to you when the subcommittee closes this budget with updated revenue projections. In addition, the NDE will provide updated enrollment counts. There will also be possible corrections for the reporting of local special education funding used in the funding model, as well as some other technical adjustments that have been identified by the Governor's Finance Office, the Department of Education, and fiscal staff. Accordingly, the subcommittee may wish to provide fiscal staff with further direction as the model will be updated in May 2023 to reflect those changes. So the subcommittee, we've prepared some various items to be discussed today. There will be no formal vote, but rather we're looking for general direction from the subcommittee on what you would like to see when we come forward in May. Madam Chair, with your permission, we'll go through the 9 items and then we'll be available for questions similar to the work session yesterday.
Thank you very much, and please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first issue to be discussed is the general fund appropriations for the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan account. The governor's recommended budget for the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan increases revenue by $2 billion over the biennium. However, this increase is entirely comprised of non-general fund revenue, as the governor recommends general fund remaining flat and consistent with the legislatively approved amount for the current 21-23 biennium. Nevada Revised Statute 387-12455 does require the governor, as practicable, to recommend general fund appropriations for the state education fund based on the economic forum projections for the state general fund, which reflected a 2.9% increase for the upcoming biennium, in comparison to the combined rate of inflation, which reflects a 4.52% increase for calendar year 21, and the growth of enrollment, with the governor recommending an increase of 0.10% in each year of the upcoming biennium. During the budget hearing, the governor's finance office was asked why the governor had not increased general fund appropriations in the pupil-centered funding plan account, and in response, the director of the governor's finance office indicated that the governor's budget does reflect a significant increase in K-12 education funding due to the dedicated revenue streams. In addition, the director indicated that there are other critical state functions that the governor needed to fund as well as K-12 education. I would note the governor does have the authority to determine such an increase in general fund appropriation is impracticable. However, Section 5 of NRS 387-12455 also requires a recommendation to be accompanied by proposed legislation from the governor to improve the method for funding of public schools in the state. The director of the governor's finance office did provide an overview of that legislation, which has since been introduced as AB 459. This bill would indicate that the amount of funding provided for the state education fund should be adjusted rather than increased. It also allows the increase in funding for the state education fund to be based on the rate of growth projected by the Economic Forum or the combined rate of inflation and growth of enrollment, whichever is less. The NDE was asked to provide its calculation of the general fund appropriation that would have been provided had the governor followed the law and provided that increase and determined it had been practicable. And the department provided its projections, which show a $60.6 million increase in general fund appropriations in each year of the upcoming biennium. Again, that reflects that inflationary growth of 4.52%, as well as enrollment growth of 0.10%. I would note the requirement to increase general fund appropriations as practicable is on the governor, and the legislature does not have the same requirement in the legislatively approved budget. Therefore, there are no statutory requirements for the legislature to adjust general fund appropriations. But the decision to be made at closing is whether to recommend approving or revising the governor's recommended general fund appropriations for the pupil-centered funding plan account for the upcoming biennium. And Madam Chair, the second item that we've identified is related to the education stabilization account. The governor recommends three major items for that account, and that includes allowing the account to be used to provide advances to the pupil-centered funding plan account if needed for cash flow purposes. The second item is not including a balance forward from the account to the pupil-centered funding plan account, although it does appear the account would reach its statutory cap at the end of fiscal year 2023. The third item is not including this account in the executive budget, which would allow it to operate outside the requirements of the State Budget Act and the requirements of IFC review and approval. As some additional information, Nevada Revised Statute 387-1213 establishes the Education Stabilization Account, and this is otherwise known as the K-12 Rainy Day Account in the State Education Fund. The balance in the pupil-centered funding plan account that has not been committed for expenditure at the end of a biennium is transferred each year to the Education Stabilization Account. In addition, each county school district must generally transfer its ending fund balance greater than 16.6% to the account. The IFC may use the funds in the Education Stabilization Account for two purposes. The first is if actual enrollment comes in greater than projected. The second item is if the collection of revenue will result in the State Education Fund receiving 97% or less of the money authorized for expenditure. During the budget hearing on March 1st, The various items were discussed, including cash flow, and it was noted that the monthly payments from the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan account to the school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils, which is the Davidson Academy on the University of Nevada, Reno campus, those begin in late July each fiscal year. However, some of the revenue sources for the plan are deposited in the budget months after their collection, and that includes property tax revenue, which begins to be deposited beginning in August, and the local school support tax or sales tax, which begins to be deposited in the budget beginning in late September. Other revenues, such as the transfer from the Cannabis Compliance Board or the annual slot tax revenue, those occur at the end of the fiscal year being closed as well. Because of this, general fund appropriations are utilized to fund expenditures in this budget at the start of the fiscal year. Once those general fund appropriations are spent, though, the budget may reflect a negative balance until the other revenue sources are deposited. To address this issue, the 2021 K-12 Education Funding Bill, SB 458 of the 21 session, provided the Governor's Finance Office with the ability to transfer general fund appropriations between fiscal years in a biennium. This addressed the cash flow issue. However, that authority would only assist in year one, as the Governor's Finance Office could transfer from the year 2 to year 1 general fund appropriations. However, in the second year of the biennium, the first year is closed, general fund appropriations would not be available to transfer to year 2. So that would only help with year 1. I would note that in fiscal year 2022, revenue exceeded forecasts and enrollment was less than projected in the pupil-centered funding plan. Accordingly, $527 million was balanced forward from FY22 to 23 in the plan. Despite that excess revenue and lower than projected enrollment, in April 2022, the Governor's Finance Office did process a non-IFC work program that transferred appropriations of $88 million from FY23 to FY22 to help with cash flow. That provided that temporary necessary revenue to make payments from the pupil-centered funding plan, and that general fund appropriation was later transferred back to FY23. Fiscal staff estimates that in a typical fiscal year, the pupil-centered funding plan account may reflect a negative fund balance as early as January or February of the fiscal year. To provide the necessary funding, the governor does recommend that the Education Stabilization Account be used to provide advances to the pupil-centered funding plan to help with cash flow purposes, and Assembly Bill 458 has been submitted to implement this change. Under the bill, the Director of the Governor's Finance Office would notify the State Controller and the Fiscal Analysis Division of his or her approval of a request for a temporary advance. Any money that is temporarily advanced must be repaid by August 31st following the end of the fiscal year where the advance was made. I would note the bill as introduced does not require IFC approval for those advances to occur. The second issue related to the Education Stabilization Account is the balance forward. As mentioned, the revenue came in greater than projected and enrollment was less than projected in FY22, and that caused funding totaling $527 million to be balanced forward from FY22 to FY23. Based on revenue projections and enrollment, it appears that a similar amount may be available in FY23. Combined, that could provide additional unobligated funding in the pupil-centered funding plan account of approximately $1 billion at the end of the biennium. As mentioned earlier, any funding remaining in the pupil-centered funding plan at the end of a biennium then transfers to the Education Stabilization Account. However, the Education Stabilization Account has a 15% cap of all appropriations and authorizations. So any remaining funding that exceeds that amount must instead be transferred to the State Education Fund and reflected as a balance forward in the pupil-centered funding plan account. Based on this 15% cap, fiscal staff calculates the FY23 cap to be maxed out at $733.6 million. Based on that $1 billion assumption, that would leave about $321 million of remaining funding that could be transferred to the pupil-centered funding plan account to use as expenditures. However, that balance forward is not reflected in the executive budget. I would note, too, that Chapter 387 of Nevada Revised Statute does not provide funding in the pupil-centered funding plan to be balanced forward and otherwise not expended through the plan. The third major issue with the educational stabilization account is its inclusion in the executive budget, or lack thereof. The education stabilization account is not reflected in the executive budget, and therefore any legislative changes in the account would not be subject to the provisions of the State Budget Act, including IFC review and approval in certain circumstances. During the budget hearing, the Governor's Finance Office was asked about this, and she indicated that since the educational stabilization account would not reflect expenditures, it was not included in the executive budget. Further, she indicated that this was consistent with the state's treatment of the general fund rainy day account, which is also not in the executive budget. However, as previously indicated, the education stabilization account can be used by the IFC if enrollment projections are greater than projected, or if revenue comes in less than projected as well. So it could be, there could be expenditures from that account. The subcommittee, therefore, could consider including the educational stabilization account in the K-12 funding bill for 2023, which would then make it subject to the State Budget Act and IFC review and approval. So that is a decision point for the subcommittee. I would note that AB 400 was recently introduced, and that would implement various changes to the educational stabilization account as it's currently written. This includes not allowing or not requiring the account to retain its interest earnings. The account currently retains all interest that it earns. Under AB 400, as introduced, any interest earnings would be transferred to the existing Teach Nevada Scholarship Program account, and that would be 75% of the interest earnings. And the remaining 25% of the interest earnings would be transferred to a new Nevada Teacher Advancement Scholarship Program account. The bill would also require any funding in the educational stabilization account in excess of 15% of all appropriations and authorizations, but not more than 17% to be transferred to the new state teacher pipeline account, 50% would go to that account, and the new early childhood literacy and readiness account, 50% would be going to that account as well. The bill would also require any funding in the account in excess of 17% to be transferred to the state teacher pipeline account, and that would be 1% of the total funding in excess of 17, and the early childhood literacy and readiness account. And the remainder of funding would be transferred to the state education fund, in other words, the pupil-centered funding plan account. Finally, the bill reflects a one-time FY 2025 only transfer of any funding in excess of 15% to the state teacher pipeline account, and that would be 50% of that excess amount, and the remaining 50% for the early childhood literacy and readiness account. Therefore, if Assembly Bill 400 is approved, it appears 3 new budgets would be established, and these budgets would need to be included in the 2023 K-12 education funding bill or the 2023 Authorizations Act, because that is where traditionally the legislature has placed pre-K funding to kind of separate pre-K and K-12 funding. Additionally, additional funding may be transferred to the pupil-centered funding account from the educational stabilization account in FY 2024. Therefore, it appears under all scenarios, fiscal staff would need to determine the amount of remaining funding that would be left in the pupil-centered funding plan at the end of FY 23. And NDE could assist with that and maybe develop a consensus forecast on that remaining amount, and then the balances that would either transfer to these new accounts under AB 400 or balance forward in the pupil-centered funding account under current law. So, Madam Chair, the major decisions to be made at closing related to the educational stabilization account. The first is cash flow, and whether the subcommittee wishes to allow the education stabilization account to be used to provide advances to the pupil-centered funding plan as proposed in AB 458 or other enabling legislation. If that is approved, the subcommittee may also consider if it wishes to make those advances subject to IFC review and approval or not. As far as the remaining funding in the pupil-centered funding plan account and in the educational stabilization account, there are a couple options to consider there. The first is to recommend whether to recommend approval of the changes to the educational stabilization account that are proposed in Assembly Bill 400, as recommended by the governor. And that would require, again, the establishment of those new budgets. The second possibility is increasing the 15% cap in the educational stabilization account to allow for additional or all remaining funding in the state education fund to be transferred to the account at the end of FY23. The third is possibly allowing for a balance forward of funding greater than the 15% in the educational stabilization account to the pupil-centered funding plan account. And that's under current law, so that the educational stabilization account would fill to 15%, and then the excess would be transferred to the pupil-centered funding plan account as a balance forward to be spent in the upcoming biennium. The fourth option is possibly revising Chapter 387 of NRS to allow for a balance forward of funding greater than the 15% cap in the educational stabilization account, and just placing that amount into reserve in the pupil-centered funding plan account in FY 2024 and not expending that funding. However, again, it appears that calculations would need to be done to calculate that what is expected to be remaining at the end of FY 2023, and therefore assistance from NDE and the GFO would be necessary to maybe come up with that consensus balance forward forecast. Finally, the third issue with the education stabilization account is its exclusion in the executive budget. So the subcommittee can determine whether it wishes to recommend excluding the account from the K-12 funding bill or including it, and therefore making it subject to IFC review and approval. And next, my colleague Madison Ryan will take the next issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Drost. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee. Madison Ryan, LCB Fiscal for the record. The third item for discussion and possible consideration is transportation funding for charter schools. So the Commission on School Funding recommended transportation funding be provided to charter schools and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils. However, the governor does not recommend funding be provided to those schools in the governor's recommended budget. So over the 2021-22 interim, the Commission on School Funding reviewed the funding provided for food service and transportation costs through the pupil-centered funding plan and made various recommendations for changes. There were 5 recommendations, which includes charter schools and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils should be provided with this funding using the same methodology established for school districts, which is the average of actual expenditures. The second recommendation includes charter schools offering these services for the first time should develop a line item budget based on projected needs that would be submitted with a grant application to the Department of Education for possible funding. The third recommendation is a hold harmless adjustment should be applied to these costs in the event expenditures decrease compared to the previous fiscal year. The fourth recommendation is an inflation adjustment factor for these services should be established that mirrors the inflationary factor for the pupil-centered funding plan. And the fifth recommendation from the Commission is the average used to calculate transportation costs would exclude any capital cost, with school district capital costs initially funded on a per pupil basis based on the number of buses in operation, a 15-year average life per bus, a cost of $150,000 per bus, and total enrollment. And charter schools would receive the same amount of per pupil funding as the school district where the charter school operates. So despite these recommendations from the Commission on School Funding, none of these changes are reflected in the executive budget. And for example, the State Public Charter School Authority indicates the Nevada Prep Charter School currently provides comprehensive transportation services and offered transportation services to its pupils since October 2018. And over the past 4 fiscal years, Nevada Prep Charter School has expended an average of roughly $62,000 annually for transportation services. And the subcommittee could consider recommending that Nevada Prep Charter School and any other charter school and university school for profoundly gifted pupils that provide transportation funding in the future be provided with transportation funding through the pupil-centered funding plan. However, this would require changes to NRS Chapter 387, which currently limits transportation funding to school districts. So if the subcommittee wishes to provide funding as recommended by the Commission on School Funding, this could include recommending those schools that provide comprehensive transportation services be provided with their average expenditures through the pupil-centered funding plan, similar to the current funding provided to school districts. and those schools that do not currently offer transportation services be allowed to apply for initial funding to establish such services. So the decision to be made at closing for the subcommittee would include whether to recommend approval of the governor's recommendation to continue only providing transportation funding through the pupil-centered funding plan to school districts, or recommend transportation funding also be provided to charter schools and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils. If this recommendation is made, the subcommittee may also consider the funding to be budgeted for this purpose and how this funding would be provided to charter schools and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils. And with that, Madam Chair, I will pass it to Ms. Camacho Poco for the next item for discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Ryan. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee. My name is Liliana Camacho, Fiscal Analysis Division. I will be going over the statewide base per pupil funding. And the governor recommends a statewide base per pupil funding amount of $8,596 in fiscal year 2024 and $9,023 in fiscal year 2025. Based on an inflationary increase of 4.52% funding and the residual funding available in the pupil-centered funding plan account. The 2021 legislature approved a statewide base per pupil funding amount of $7,074 for fiscal year 2023, and the governor recommends increasing this to $8,596 in fiscal year 2024 and $9,023 in fiscal year 2025. And consistent with the legislative intent provided in Section 1 of NRS 387.1214, the governor recommends increasing the statewide base per pupil amount by the 4.52% Consumer Price Index inflationary increase from calendar year 2020 to calendar year 2021, which was the most recent data available when the executive budget was being prepared. And then increasing it further based on the projected pupil-centered funding plan revenue that would be available in each year of the 2023-25 biennium. Then a proportional reduction would be applied in each year to balance to revenue. Turning to page 10, you can see there's a table that provides the Consumer Price Index inflationary changes for the past 15 years. And as you can see, there can be significant variation in the annual Consumer Price Index changes between individual calendar years, including the decreases as reflected in calendar year 2009 of negative 0.38% changes. And that was the change between calendar year 2008 and calendar year 2009, which is most likely, which was probably during the Great Recession. During the budget hearing on March 1st, 2023, there was discussion about the use of inflationary increase from a single period to budget for future increases. To address this issue, the subcommittee could consider revising NRS 387 and its definition of rate of inflation to utilize a multi-year average to calculate this change. And this would allow for the smoothing of inflationary changes as drastic annual increases or decreases are experienced, and also allow for the data for other years to be considered when a single year experiences a negative change. So the decision for the subcommittee to be made at closing is to recommend whether to recommend revising NRS and its definition of rate of inflation to utilize a multi-year average, and it may also consider directing the fiscal staff to utilize that multi-year average in updating the pupil-centered funding plan model. And the next topic will be funding for online school districts. And currently, online school districts receive the statewide base per pupil funding amount, while online school district schools receive the adjusted base per pupil funding amount. And the Commission on School Funding recommended that online school district schools be funded at the statewide base per pupil amount to ensure equitable funding. However, the governor's recommended budget does not reflect this change and instead provides online school districts with the adjusted base per pupil funding amount. Currently under NRS 387, online charter schools receive the statewide base per pupil funding amount, while online school district schools receive the adjusted base per pupil amount. And accordingly, Senate Bill 98 was introduced on behalf of the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Education and would, among other items, provide only the statewide base per pupil funding amount to online school districts. And if approved, it would allow online charter schools and online school district schools to receive a similar level of funding. So the decision to be made at closing is whether to recommend that an online school district school receive the statewide base per pupil funding amount consistent with online charter schools. And this recommendation would also require Senate Bill 98 or other enabling legislation to be approved to reflect this change in statute. Thank you.
For the record, Adam Dross with the Fiscal Analysis Division. The next major issue to be discussed is the Nevada Cost of Education Index. The governor recommends the use of the Nevada Cost of Education Index to account for variation in the cost of goods and the cost of labor across the state. The governor also recommends a floor of 1.0 be applied to the index, thereby allowing counties with a calculated index below the floor amount to not have their schools' funding reduced. As background, NRS 387-1215 provides a cost adjustment factor to be established for variation in the cost of goods and the cost of labor within the state. This index is applied to each school district, charter school that provides classroom-based instruction, and university school for profoundly gifted pupils. And the baseline index amount for this index is 1.0, with schools operating in counties above that baseline receiving additional funding, and schools operating in counties below that baseline receiving reduced funding. The Nevada Cost of Education Index in the executive budget is comprised of two components. The first is the comparative wage index that measures what an employer must pay to attract employees in light of, or in some circumstances in spite of, the different influencing factors in the community. And that could include the desirability of place, including the climate, the cultural amenities, safety, commute times, or recreational opportunities. While a location may have a high cost of living or a high cost of housing, if it is an otherwise attractive place to live, employers are able to attract staff. This index includes all occupational and industry areas and all education levels. And an amount was calculated for Clark County, Washoe County, Carson City, Douglas, Lyons, and Story counties collectively, and the rest of the state combined based on 2020 data. The other component for the Nevada Cost of Education Index is the Regional Price Parity Index, and that's provided with data from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. And that shows the regional cost differences amongst school districts associated with purchasing goods. As approved by the legislature and recommended by the governor for the upcoming biennium, a floor of 1.0 is being applied to this index. Therefore, any counties that are below that 1.0 index are not having any of their funding reduced in either the legislatively approved budget for the current biennium and as proposed by the governor for the upcoming biennium. I would note the Commission on School Funding, a letter of intent was issued to the Commission and the Department to study the Nevada Cost of Education Index over the interim, and the Commission on School Funding discussed this issue at length and at numerous meetings over the interim. The Commission on School Funding ultimately recommended to eliminate the effect of the Nevada Cost of Education Index from the model, and that could be implemented by providing all counties with an index of 1.00. For the upcoming biennium, the only county that would benefit from the governor's recommended Nevada Cost of Education Index is Clark County, which has a calculated index of 1.006. 5 counties have a calculated index below 1.0, and that includes Carson City, Douglas, Lyon, Story, and Washoe counties. However, that floor of 1.0 is applied, so they are not losing any funding because of it. The remaining 11 counties have a calculated index of 1.0. During the budget hearing, the department was asked about the exclusion of cost of housing in this measure, and the department indicated the subject matter experts that worked with other states to develop a similar measure recommended that housing costs not be included in this index. They indicated that additional funding was being provided to more affluent neighborhoods when this is applied in other states, and therefore that recommendation was made to exclude that. During the budget hearing as well, it was indicated that the Nevada Cost of Education Index could be updated with more recent data, and the department indicates it could update using calendar year 2021 data and have that available by the end of April. Fiscal staff would also note that Assembly Bill 344 has been introduced, and that would repeal NRS 387-1215 and eliminate the Nevada Cost of Education Index from the pupil-centered funding plan entirely. So the decisions to be made at closing is for the subcommittee is whether to recommend utilizing the Nevada Cost of Education Index or applying an index of 1.0 for all counties, effectively eliminating the effect of the index as recommended by the Commission on School Funding. Or a third option is recommending NRS 37125 be eliminated through either passage of AB 344 or other enabling legislation. If the subcommittee recommends utilizing the index in the upcoming biennium, it could also consider whether it recommends approving the governor's recommended Nevada Cost of Education Index or updating the index with updated information. Additionally, the subcommittee could consider approving the governor's recommendation to use a floor of 1.0 or using the actual calculation, which again would take from some of those districts that have an index below 1.0. The next major issue to be discussed is weighted funding. The governor recommends providing weighted funding of 0.50 for English learner pupils, 0.30 for at-risk pupils, and 0.12 for gifted and talented pupils. In the executive budget, the audited October 1st, 2022 enrollment counts for these weighted student populations were used to determine the weighted funding that would be allocated in the executive budget in both FY24 and FY25. I would note that pupils eligible for special education funding are excluded from this count. So special education pupils do not get this additional weighted funding. In addition, and consistent with NRS, a pupil eligible for more than one weighted category only receives the weighted funding for the category that would provide him or her with the highest weight. Your table on page 14 provides the weighted funding approved by the 21 legislature as well as recommended by the governor for FY24 and 25. As you can see, there are some increases in the weighted funding as well as the weights themselves that are recommended in the executive budget. One other point that I would make would be that the at-risk funding is the count of at-risk funding is recommended to increase as identified in FY23 from 247,286 students to, in the governor's recommended budget, 63,325 at-risk pupils. The reason for that reduction is a change in the identification of at-risk pupils. As approved by the 21 legislature, at-risk pupils are identified based on their eligibility for free or reduced price lunch. However, the governor recommends, which is consistent with the State Board of Education action and the Commission on School Funding recommendation, to use a grad score using data from the Infinite Campus student data system. This grad score identifies pupils who are not on track to graduate with their cohort using data from the Infinite Campus data system. And this includes, as testified during the budget hearing, 75 different measures, which it could include academic proficiency, attendance, behavior, home and enrollment stability. Further, the department indicates that it identified the bottom 20th percentile of pupils at this, that are identified through the grad score, and that aligns with the count of pupils that do not graduate with their cohort. Fiscal staff asked the NDE to elaborate on the process used to determine a grad score, both for primary schools, which is K through 5, as well as secondary schools, which is grades 6 through 12. And the NDE indicated Infinite Campus utilizes two separate models, primary and secondary. With the secondary model, uses student outcomes, specifically whether or not they graduate on time, as the ground truth labels during training for the system. For the primary model, the ground truth labels that are identified for secondary are used by both to determine those students at the earlier grades who are also not on track to graduate. So the measure does track whether a pupil is on track to graduate with their peer, and it seems to be kind of a learning process as it has new data on students as well as those who are not on track to graduate. During the budget hearing, the NDE indicated this change would be more appropriate method for identifying at-risk pupils due to the expansion of the community eligibility provision. And as a reminder, under that provision, if at least 40% of all pupils in a school are otherwise eligible for free lunch, all pupils in that school are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. The NDE maintained that some pupils who are not at risk but attend these schools are being included in that count of at-risk pupils. Further, the NDE provided information related to the increase in pupils eligible for free and reduced price lunch, and that shows a 30.8% increase in pupils eligible for free and reduced price lunch between the 2018-19 school year and the 2022-23 school year. So the department indicated that to provide a measure for identifying students at risk of not graduating with their peers, this grad score would provide a better indicator. And again, would use that bottom 20th percentile, which aligns with those pupils that do not graduate with their peers. The department further indicated that although 75 measures are used in the Infinite Campus system to identify grad scores and determine this factor, no single measure is used to calculate the grad score that's weighted high enough to significantly move a pupil along an indicator. The NDE also indicated that if free and reduced price lunch was utilized to identify at-risk pupils, the count would be much greater than the 63,000 identified in the executive budget, and that would actually total about 284,000 pupils. Accordingly, if the subcommittee wishes to recommend utilizing free and reduced price lunch to identify at-risk pupil, the per pupil funding provided for at-risk pupils in the executive budget, as well as the weight, would require additional funding. And the NDE estimates that additional funding of $566 million in FY24 and $596 in FY25 would be needed to provide the governor's recommended at-risk weight of 0.30 for at-risk pupils if the free and reduced price lunch was used as a measure. Would also note that, as I previously indicated, the October 1st, 2022 enrollment counts were used to determine both the weighted counts for FY24 and 25 in the executive budget. And this is consistent with the legislatively approved budget where the October 1st, 2020 count was used for both years. However, the NDE then approached the IFC and received approval to update the second year of the biennium counts and the amount provided to school districts based on the updated count from the October 1st count of the following year. The NDE has asked for the same ability in the upcoming biennium, and that would be consistent with the legislatively approved budget. However, I would note when the NDE came to IFC for that FY23 adjustment, additional funding of about $10.6 million was needed because of an increase in weighted funding counts. That was approved by the IFC in December 2022. However, the pupil-centered funding plan does not have a reserve. So that additional funding was paid for by the additional revenue that was generated and balanced forward that I mentioned earlier. Therefore, if the subcommittee wishes to provide the department with the ability to update the enrollment counts in the second year of the biennium, it may consider providing additional funding as a reserve in the second year in case that weighted enrollment increases. Alternatively, the educational stabilization account can be used for enrollment growth. So it would appear to be eligible if they had that enrollment growth. It could also tap the educational stabilization account to pay for that in the second year of the biennium. So, Madam Chair, there are various items to consider here. The first is whether to recommend approval of the governor's recommendation to identify at-risk pupils using the grad score calculated from the Infinite Campus system, or approving the use of free and reduced price lunch to identify at-risk pupils. The second is whether to recommend approval of the governor's recommendation to provide weighted funding of 0.50 for English learner pupils, 0.30 for at-risk pupils, and 0.12 for gifted and talented pupils, or approval of an alternative weighted funding for those weighted students, and possibly providing the same level of funding, the dollar amount provided for those weighted pupil counts. Finally, is whether to recommend allowing the weighted enrollment counts to be updated in FY25, the second year of the biennium, using October 1st, 2023 enrollment counts and identifying the funding source to fund any possible increases in expenditures associated with that change. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Madison Ryan.
Thank you. Madison Ryan, LCB Fiscal for the record. The next item for discussion is related to the account for state special education services, which is outside the pupil-centered funding plan. So the account for state special education services, just as some background, provides state funding for pupils with disabilities. And the state funding for the state special education program provides funding proportionally to each school district and charter school, largely based upon the number of pupils with a disability not to exceed 13% of the total pupil enrollment for the school district or charter school as required by NRS. And during the account for state special education services budget hearing on March 1st, members of the subcommittee discussed the state special education program funding compared to other weighted funding provided through the pupil-centered funding plan, and the current funding distribution methodology utilized by the Department of Education for allocating funding for the state special education program. And for the 2023-25 biennium, the governor recommends total funding for the state special education program of $233.1 million in fiscal year 2024 and $237.5 million in fiscal year 2025, inclusive of the funding recommended by the governor for the 2% roll-up costs, which is approximately $13.1 million over the 2023-25 biennium. Additionally, based on fiscal staff's analysis of the current level of funding and enrollment counts included in the governor's recommended budget for both the pupil-centered funding plan and the account for state special education services, it appears that the statewide average weighted multiplier and average per pupil amount for special education pupils could be less than the weighted multiplier and the average per pupil amount for English learner pupils in each year of the 2023-25 biennium. Additionally, the second issue is related to the current distribution methodology that is currently utilized by the department for the state special education program, which currently results in some school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils receiving less per pupil funding for special education pupils than the statewide average in fiscal year 2023 and in each year of the 2023-25 biennium. So for some background, the 2021 legislature approved the governor's recommendation to provide funding for pupils with disabilities outside of the pupil-centered funding plan and approved excluding special education pupils who belong to other weighted categories from receiving weighted funding related to English learner, at-risk, and gifted and talented pupils. And funding for special education pupils was provided as a multiplier, which was higher when compared to the weighted funding provided through the pupil-centered funding plan. So the governor recommends that special education pupils who belong to other weighted categories be excluded from other weighted funding for the 2023-25 biennium, even though it appears that English learner pupils would receive more on an average per pupil basis than special education pupils in each year of the 2023-25 biennium. And so in Appendix B, there is a table that provides a comparison between the weighted funding, including pupils with disabilities as calculated by fiscal staff and approved by the 2021 legislature for fiscal year 2023 and recommended by the governor for fiscal year 2025 and fiscal year 2024, based on October 1, 2022 enrollment counts. And then additionally, you would note that the unduplicated count data for pupils eligible for weighted funding in the pupil-centered funding plan exclude special education pupils from all other weighted categories, since special education funding historically provided a higher level of funding. And given this, the subcommittee could consider revising this methodology by allowing special education pupils to also receive other weighted funding for which they are eligible, or allowing special education pupils to only receive weighted funding through the pupil-centered funding plan for which they may be eligible if that weight is higher than the special education weight. So for the 2023-25 biennium, the only weight in the pupil-centered funding plan that appears to be higher than the special education weight is English learners. And the department provided information indicating there were 12,275 pupils with disabilities who were also identified to be English learners following the March 1st budget hearing. And then additionally, the second issue based on the current distribution methodology includes providing local educational agencies with a similar level of funding as was received in the prior fiscal year. So the level of funding provided to school districts with static or decreasing special education enrollment is held at a somewhat consistent level. And additionally, Entities that have growth in special education enrollment are also held at a somewhat consistent funding level, which reduces the funding provided on a per pupil basis. So there's a table in Appendix C, which provides an overview of the current methodology the department uses to distribute a similar level of state special education funding, and the impact this distribution methodology has on the average per pupil amount and the average weighted multiplier in fiscal year 2023 based on the department calculations, and the projected fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025 funding distributions based on fiscal staff calculations. And it also identifies those school districts, charter schools, and the University School for Profoundly Gifted Pupils that received a per pupil amount and had a calculated weighted multiplier less than the statewide average in fiscal year 2023 and in fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025. So the governor's recommended budget appears to provide a weighted multiplier for pupils with disabilities that is less than the weighted multiplier for English learners and does not include recommendations to address those school districts, charter schools, and the University School for Profoundly Gifted Pupils that currently receive a per pupil amount less than the statewide average in the 2023-25 biennium. So the subcommittee could consider providing additional funding for the state special education program than what is currently included in the governor's recommended budget, or other alternatives that do not require additional funding in the 2023-25 biennium. So various scenarios have been developed by fiscal staff that the subcommittee could consider to fund the state special education program. However, it should be noted that the state has a maintenance of fiscal support requirement that requires state special education funding to generally be maintained in future fiscal years. So if any funding is added to this budget for the 2023-25 biennium, it would be required to continue in future biennia. So the first scenario the subcommittee could consider is scenario A, which would provide each local educational agency with at least the projected governor recommended statewide average per pupil amount, and would require additional general fund appropriations of $22.4 million over the 2023-25 biennium. The second scenario, scenario B, would provide a per pupil amount higher than what is recommended for English learners in each year of the 2023-25 biennium, and would require additional general fund appropriations of $46.9 million over the 2023-25 biennium. The third scenario, scenario C, would provide a minimum special education weighted multiplier of 0.49 in each year of the 2023-25 biennium, and an average statewide weighted multiplier of 0.51 in each year of the biennium, and would require general fund appropriations of $36.5 million over the 2023-25 biennium. The fourth scenario, scenario D, would provide a minimum special education weighted multiplier of 0.51 in each year of the 2023-25 biennium for each school district, charter school, and University School for Profoundly Gifted Pupils, and would require general fund appropriations of $53.5 million over the 2023-25 biennium. Additionally, there are alternative scenarios the subcommittee could consider in lieu of adding funding to this budget, which include reducing the weighted multiplier for English learner pupils in the pupil-centered funding plan from what is currently recommended by the governor, which could result in the statewide average weighted multiplier for the state special education program to be the highest weighted category. Another alternative includes providing pupils with disabilities who are also identified as English learners with weighted funding through the pupil-centered funding plan, which would require additional funding in the pupil-centered funding plan account of $52.8 million in fiscal year 2024 and $55.4 million in fiscal year 2025. Additionally, the subcommittee could consider reallocating the governor's recommendation of $13.1 million over the 2023-25 biennium for roll-up costs to instead be allocated to only those school districts, charter schools, and the University School for Profoundly Gifted Pupils that currently receive a per pupil amount less than the statewide average. And then additionally, would just note that during the March 1st budget hearing, the department indicated that it is in the process of contracting with subject matter experts to review and study the current distribution methodology for state special education funding and the various factors related to the distribution of this funding. The subcommittee could approve the level of funding included in the governor's recommended budget for the state special education program and not make any changes to the program for the 2023-25 biennium, and request the NDE provide the 2025 legislature with the recommended changes for the state special education program and funding once the department completes its work. So, Madam Chair, there are various options to consider during closing, which includes for the first item, whether to recommend approval of the governor's recommended funding of $233.1 million in fiscal year 2025 and $237.5 million. Fiscal year 2024 for 233.1 and 237.5 million in fiscal year 2025 for the state special education program, which includes the 13.1 million over the biennium to fund 2% roll-up costs and may not provide the highest weighted funding when compared to the weighted funding recommended in the pupil-centered funding plan. The second would be to whether to recommend approval of the governor's recommended funding and additional general fund appropriations as provided in scenarios A through D, and for the state special education program to provide a minimum level of state special education funding either on a per pupil or weighted basis for each school district, charter school, and the university schools for profoundly gifted pupils. However, doing so would require that funding be provided on an ongoing basis to comply with federal maintenance of fiscal support requirements. Additionally, the subcommittee could also consider recommending reducing the weighted multiplier for English learner pupils in the pupil-centered funding plan account from what is currently recommended by the governor, which could result in the statewide average weighted multiplier for the state special education program being the highest weighted category, or allowing pupils with disabilities who are eligible for a higher weight through the pupil-centered funding plan to receive weighted funding for a weight higher than the state special education weighted multiplier through the pupil-centered funding plan in addition to state special education funding, or reallocating the governor's recommendation of $13.1 million over the biennium for roll-up costs to instead be allocated to only those school districts, charter schools, and the university school for profoundly gifted pupils that currently receive a per pupil amount less than the statewide average. And with that, I will pass it to Mr. Drost to walk through the next decision.
Thank you. Again, for the record, Adam Drost with Fiscal Analysis Division. The final issue is the balancing expenditures to revenue in the updated pupil-centered funding plan account. Fiscal staff will need to balance the pupil-centered funding plan model with updated revenue, updated enrollment, recommendations of the subcommittee. Therefore, general direction is requested of the subcommittee at this time to help with that process, which I would note will be the first time we will be doing so as we move into the second biennium of implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. As background, the 23 legislature has already taken action to modify the funding that would be provided to the pupil-centered funding plan, and this includes SB 124, which provided additional net proceeds of minerals revenue for the plan in FY24. In addition, the Governor's Finance Office and LCB Fiscal will update its consensus revenue forecast in May 2023 based on additional months of data. Finally, changes to projected enrollment and possible changes to the identification and count of pupils eligible for weighted funding based on the subcommittee's recommendations may also be reflected in the model. Therefore, the subcommittee will need to consider whether it will revise the statewide base per pupil amount to balance to the updated revenue projections, or utilize the general fund to negate possible reductions in non-general fund revenue, thereby allowing the funding levels recommended by the governor to be reflected in the legislatively approved budget. The subcommittee could also provide fiscal staff with some general guidelines, and that would possibly include maintaining at least the statewide base per pupil amount in the governor's recommended budget, which could require additional general fund appropriations and or shifting general fund appropriations between fiscal years in the upcoming biennium. In addition, fiscal staff could be provided with guideline to maintain at least the same level of funding amounts, that's the dollar amounts, that are recommended by the governor for the weighted categories of pupils. If additional funding is still available, the subcommittee could direct fiscal staff to utilize this remaining funding to adjust the weights for English learners, at-risk, and gifted and talented pupils to ensure they are as reasonably similar to the governor's recommended weights as possible. If still additional funding remains, it could be used to adjust the statewide base per pupil funding amount while maintaining the governor's recommended weights to utilize any residual funding. So the decisions to be made at closing is whether the subcommittee will need to determine how it wishes fiscal staff to balance the pupil-centered funding plan model with the various updates that will be provided in May 2023. Again, that direction to fiscal staff could possibly include maintaining at least the statewide base per pupil amount reflected in the governor's recommended budget, which could require additional general fund appropriations or again shifting general fund appropriations between fiscal years in the upcoming biennium. And maintaining at least the same level of funding, the dollar amount, provided to the weighted categories of pupils. If additional funding is still available, the subcommittee could direct fiscal staff to utilize this remaining funding to first adjust the weights for English learners, at-risk, and gifted and talented pupils to ensure they are as reasonably similar to the governor's recommended weights as possible. If additional funding remains, it could be used to adjust the statewide base per pupil amount while maintaining the governor's recommended weights to utilize any residual funding. And Madam Chair, that completes our presentation, and I assume there's a question or two that we are ready to answer. Thank you.
Maybe the R2. Thank you very much for that presentation. I know how hard you all work, and we totally appreciate your time, your expertise, and the long hours. With that committee, are there questions? Assemblywoman Neal, Senator Neal, please go ahead.
So, Madam Chair, I want to know, do we have to go in order of the presentation, or is it?
I think it would be helpful for us to stay within the parameters of each subject, and then we'll go forward if you don't mind.
Okay, then I can wait, because I'm in the
Okay.
middle.
Then I will go to Assemblywoman Kasama. So we'll start with the general fund appropriations for pupil-centered funding plan. Senator Titus.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, yeah, going way back to page 7, the very first decision items, I just had some general questions on process and understanding. You mentioned that the education stabilization account is very similar to the rainy day account in that the governor doesn't have to get legislative approval to use those funds. Is that what you mentioned?
The relationship that was indicated by the governor's finance office was exclusion from the executive budget. I think Director Stevenson's point was the general fund rainy day fund is not in the executive budget, nor is the K-12.
So there's some parity there. So I'm
Yes,
mentioning.
yes.
So you also mentioned that we're reaching the cap on the educational stabilization account as we are in the rainy day, but that's a different subject, a different rainy day. So we're reaching that cap. Then you mentioned using the interest on that cap on certain programs that the governor recommended. What happens now, currently, under current law, when we maximize the education stabilization account? What happens to those interest payments now?
The educational stabilization account is currently able to retain all interest earnings, so it stays within that account.
Even if it's reaching, sorry, Madam Chair, may I continue? Even if it's reaching near its maximum?
Senator, that's a good question. I would have to research that and see what, once we reach the cap, the interest earnings would maybe have to play a part into that. I would have to speak with legal about that.
Great, because that would be, I think, good to have if you can get that back to us with that, because I think it's important to understand where those funds are going now as we near that maximum. I have other questions later on. Thank you, Madam Chair, for this question.
Thank you very much. And Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the question was on when you were talking about the 1% for the total funding and the education stabilization, and then the 1% for I think there's early childhood literacy and readiness. So the question that came up was, when will NDE actually calculate so that you can do the projections? Because it seemed like there were a couple of things that were dependent. The bill, number one, AB 400, and other.
Madam Chair, through you to the Senator. So that's correct. There is that 1% and all those distributions based on AB 400 as introduced. Currently, we've asked the NDE for, what are their projections for the end of FY23? They're currently in the middle of the fiscal year. They didn't provide anything, but I think that, a consensus forecast of what that would be could be determined. Something similar was provided under the Nevada plan. So it seems like the pupil-centered funding plan, we would have to calculate a similar amount to know how much is going to be, if AB 400 passes, what amounts would go to those new accounts? Or alternatively, how much would go to the pupil-centered funding plan account under current law?
Yes, go ahead, please.
So when do you expect to get that consensus forecast? Is that going to be the very end of the session?
Madam Chair, through you to the senator, we would have to have that for the subcommittee closing. So I think we'd work with NDE and the GFO, of course, and our office to see, what is the consensus forecast? Where do we think we're going to land at the end of FY23? So, April, we would have to have that information.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, and we'll go to Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was looking at the education stabilization account as well, and we're like 321 million potentially over with the automatic transfers. And then in the contemplation of AB 400, when it talks about if you've got 15 to 17%, it would go to a couple accounts. Each 1%, I was thinking that's worth almost $50 million. Is that right? Do you have the calculation on because if 733 is 15%, I have 48.9 million is 1%. No, so if 733 million is 15%, and you're talking about between 15 and 17%, 1% I think is 48.9%, or 48.9 million. I just want to confirm that. So
That appears reasonable.
yeah, so like each percentage point is 50 million. So when you look at AB 400, and if you're looking at the bandwidth between 15 and 17%, that's potentially $0 to $100 million that would be split between the teacher pipeline account and the early childhood readiness, literacy and readiness. Is that correct?
Under that bill, correct.
Thank you. And then I'm trying to get the numbers in my head. And then if we go over that, if you go past the 17%, then you start with a trigger that goes to the teacher pipeline account. Okay. And then the interest in earnings, right now, we don't know what happens if it bumps up against the cap. But do we have an idea of what interest in earnings have been and what we expect? If the account's maxed out at 733.
Year to date, the account has, according to the state financial system, has accrued $282,000 worth of interest earnings. Of course, that is based upon, the $50 million general fund loan that was provided. So if additional funding and it's near the cap, obviously interest earnings would increase as well.
Okay, but we're talking like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay, that's good. Thank you. And then you also mentioned something about a reserve, like the pupil-centered funding plan reserve, not the stabilization account. So what does the reserve run? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I did mention a reserve possibly for the weights, when they updated weights, that was indicated, possibly providing, let's say, a $10 million reserve in the second year of the biennium to account for possible increases in the weighted pupil counts and providing some funding related to that.
Thank you. So like fluctuation in enrollment?
Weighted enrollment specifically.
Weighted enrollment, okay. Thank you. That's all I have on this part. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Additional questions? I just have one clarification question. So is this the first time we've commingled pre-K funds and, say, K-12 funds?
To my knowledge, that's correct.
All right. Seeing no more questions, I believe that, I'm sorry, Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a clarifying question. Although the cap is at 15% now, we could raise that cap to maybe 20%, correct?
Madam Chair, through you to the Assemblywoman, absolutely.
And going back to the chair's question about the commingling of the funds, that has never been done in the past. Is there a reason why that hasn't been done in the past?
I would just note that traditionally, the department does have a pre-K program, and that is within a department budget. We kind of identify department budgets and K-12 budgets and kind of distinguish between the two and identify, funding provided for K-12, and then that pre-K funding we typically separate in the legislatively approved budget. And that's why I indicated the pre-K budget is not including the K-12 bill with the other K-12 programs.
Thank you so much for the clarification.
Thank you very much, and I believe Senator Gansert has a question.
Thank you for a second time. And thanks for your work on this budget. So if we were to raise the cap from 15% to 20%, that would be roughly like $245 million, given the calculation I did before, which is about $49 million per percentage point. Is that about right? 245?
I believe it's, yeah,
Okay.
Yes.
And then, just so we have that in our head, 245 million if we go 5%. And then also, you mentioned the interest in earnings was about $282,000. When you followed up and said there was the $50 million loan, was that only on the $50 million? So do we multiply that, out? So if it's 300,000 per $50 million, or is that somewhere in between the 50 that was loaned and the current balance?
Madam Chair, through you to the Senator, yes, the Education Stabilization Account did not have any money, so as seed money, the 21 legislature did provide that $50 million general fund appropriation, and that is the bulk of the funding that has been provided to that account in this current biennium.
Thank you. So you would potentially multiply that by like 15%, 15 times 3, right? 300,000? 4.5 million?
Possibly. I mean, we'd have to see. The Treasurer's Office obviously distributes earnings, and there are variations on that, but it would obviously increase beyond, because the.
So I think that's like up to 4 million a year, I'll say, something like that, 4.5 million. Anyway, just if the numbers, just so we understand that over time it actually does become a meaningful number if the 282,000 was only on $50 million. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll go to Assemblywoman Bacchus.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you all for your presentation. I just wanted to kind of follow up on Senator's question and ask is there any way we can also go ahead and take the remaining funding that may remain at the end of fiscal year 2023 in the State Education Fund and transfer that into the next biennium and consider raising the cap at the end of the next biennium?
Madam Chair, through you to the Assemblywoman, yes, absolutely. You could basically defer, keep them 15% cap for the current biennium at the end of FY23, but then at the end of the upcoming biennium, at the end of FY25, raise the cap at that point. Certainly, that could be a possibility.
Thank you very much. Assemblywoman Kasama.
So if this is a appropriate time to ask the education index, is that fine? No. Okay, we're still doing that. Okay, I'll hold up.
We're still on reading. We haven't gotten to math yet. All right. Thank you very much. And I think with that, the subcommittee could recommend approving the governor's recommended general fund appropriations for the pupil-centered funding plan account for the 23-25 biennium. And then we will move on. Yes. And then I believe because we also asked some questions on the next cash flow, we also could go ahead and recommend allowing the education stabilization account to be used to provide advance to the pupil-centered funding plan account if needed for cash flow purposes as proposed in Assembly Bill 458 or other enabling legislation. And these advances would be provided with IFC approval. And now, I believe we can continue on this to also, it appears with all the scenarios discussed on this, that we also could require that NDE calculate the projected balance in the ESA at the end of fiscal year 23 to determine the balance forward amounts. And we would request that NDE work with fiscal staff to estimate the funding that would remain in the pupil-centered funding plan at the end of fiscal year 23. And we would also recommend including that ESA 23 K-12 education funding in the executive budget, as I said earlier, with IFC approval. I think I covered all those. And with that being said, I think that at this point, we would also recommend that we would suggest that we would raise the funding from 0.15 to 0.20, and we would, as provided, if we need a funding bill.
It could go into the K-12.
Yeah,
education
it
funding
could
bill,
go into that K-12 funding bill.
And then it would come back for the committee's consideration.
And then it would come back to us for consideration. And Mr. Drost, if you would clarify that on the record for me, I sort of broke that up into pieces. There was a lot to digest there, so if you could clarify, thank you.
Certainly. Madam Chair, just to clarify that last point, the increase to 20%, does that reflect Assemblywoman Backus's thought to delay that until next biennium? Is that the thought, or?
Yes, I believe that's
great.
correct.
Okay,
That
thank you-
is the
thank you for
proper-
clarifying.
Proper verbiage. I just had to check with the suggester.
Thank you for clarifying. So just to walk through that, so for cash flow, the subcommittee does, at this point, recommends allowing the education stabilization account to be used to provide cash advances for the pupil-centered funding plan as proposed in AB 458 or other enabling legislation, and that would require IFC approval. For the remaining funding, the subcommittee recommends keeping the 15% cap at the end of 23. Any additional funding beyond the 15% would then flow over to the pupil-centered funding plan and be available as beginning cash in the account in 24. However, at the end of FY25, raise that cap to 20%. So that would be effective the next biennium. In addition, directing NDE, possibly working with LCB Fiscal and GFO to come up with that projected ending fund balance for the education stabilization account at the end of FY23, to come up with those projections. And then finally, including the education stabilization account in the executive budget, which would make it subject to IFC approval. I hope I captured everything.
Thank you. You said it much more streamlined than I did, and I appreciate that. Yes, Senator Titus.
Thank you, but would that mean the way you have just proposed that we would be draining the educational stabilization account now?
No, as as I understand the recommendation, it would retain that 15% cap at the end of '23 and into the next biennium, and then that 15% cap would be raised to 20% at the end of '25, FY25.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm thinking about the reason to do that is the $321.4 million that is over the 15% right now. The governor's budget reflects that rolling forward into the next biennium. So basically, we would create a $320 million hole if we do it like now, potentially, in the way the governor's budget is flowing between the years. Is that correct?
Just to clarify, the $1 billion, $321 million, that's rough estimate from fiscal
Right,
staff.
right.
It could change. But I would note that it is not included in the executive budget as a balance forward. So it's just not reflected in the executive budget.
Okay, so it's not, so the 320, the estimate of 320 plus million is not flowing forward right now. So that is further, but you're suggesting that we do let it flow forward. So that's an extra 321 million that goes in the PF. I always get the initials confused. Okay, all right, that's a better understanding. Thank you.
Okay, I think everybody's clear. I think everybody's asked their questions. Clear as mud, but thank you, Mr. Drost, for all that information and for clarifying that at the end. So your statement will stand, and we will move on to transportation funding for charter schools. With this particular item, we, I believe, would recommend the approval of the governor's recommendation to continue only providing transportation funding through the pupil-centered funding plan to school districts. Are there any questions? Senator Gansert.
I'm sorry, Madam. Did you skip to special ed or were you on transportation? The
We're on transportation.
Okay, and so okay, yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno.
I have not a question, Madam Chair, but more of a statement. I think in the decisions that we're looking at today, I think we should go with the governor's recommendation, which would be number one, to approve the governor's recommendation to continue only providing transportation funding through the PCFP to school districts.
Thank you very much for repeating what I recommended earlier. And are there any more questions? Thank you very much to all of you. All right, we can go on to the statewide base per pupil funding. Are there any questions on this particular funding item? We are on page 9 if you're looking at your notes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd have questions.
Thank you very much, Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So looking at the CPI, I think it makes sense to do like the 3-year rolling average, the smoothing, because that will help on the way up and it'll help on the way down as well. And the 5-year isn't as, those out years aren't as relative to what's happening during a current time frame. So I actually like the 3-year average.
Thank you very much.
I agree.
And an agree from the clouds down there. Thank you. All right. With that, then, on this particular decision, we would recommend no change in online school districts as. Oh, I skipped ahead. I'm sorry. I am sorry.
Or the statewide base.
Yeah. Hang on. I flipped a page when I shouldn't have, sorry. Then we would definitely, the subcommittee would recommend using the governor's calculated percentage change of 4.52%. And moving forward, we would recommend a revision to NRS 387.12456 and its definition of rate of inflation to utilize a 3-year average to calculate that change. Question, Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm wondering if we're going to be adjusting this year to the 3-year average. We're not. We're going to let it stay with the governor's plan and then.
Thank you for that clarification. And this year, we would be moving forward with 3-year average effective July 1st.
July 1st for fiscal year 2024.
Mr. Drost, would you clarify, please?
Yeah.
Sure, Madam Chair. I believe your intent is keep the governor's recommended CPI of 4.52% for the ledge-approved budget, but then for the governor's recommended budget for the 2025-27 biennium, he would then use the 3-year average.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions? All right, we will move on to funding for online school districts. Thank you. I don't hear any. Any questions? Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to figure out what the difference was between, I think, the adjusted versus the non-adjusted. I'm trying to find where I am again on here. But, sort of that definition of adjusted and whether to go one way or the other, because you're proposing one direction, but what if we go the other direction? Thank you.
Liliana Camacho for the record, through you, Chair, to Senator Severs-Gansert. The adjusted base per pupil funding amount includes two adjustment factors, the Nevada Cost of Education Index and the attendance area adjustment. And the attendance area adjustment reflects the increased cost to operate schools in attendance areas with low enrollment densities. And I did want to note that there are 4 districts that do have online schools, and that's Douglas, Elko, Esmeralda, and Washoe. So currently, those online school districts do receive the adjusted base per pupil funding. But the 3 online school districts for the charter schools, those receive the base per pupil funding. So just depending on which school district, it would be a different amount than the base per pupil amount.
So the online receives non-adjusted? So are we going to adjusted or non-adjusted for both?
Currently, the way the governor's recommended budget is, the online school district schools receive the adjusted base per pupil funding. And the Commission on School Funding recommended that all online school district schools receive just the base per pupil funding.
So that's sort of interesting because then we're not adjusting them for those 2 factors when we're adjusting all other students with those factors. And I don't know what this means financially. It's just, it seems somewhat inconsistent if we use adjusted for all other schools, for all other students in schools.
Do you have some clarification for us, please?
Sure, Madam Chair, through you to the Senator. Just to clarify, so currently, under current law, online charter schools only receive the statewide amount. Online school district schools get the adjusted amount. What the Commission on School Funding recommended was that they should both get just the statewide average amount. But the governor's recommended budget keeps that difference. The governor's recommended budget continues to provide online school district schools with the adjusted amount. So that's the decision point for the subcommittee.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Just for clarification, we're talking 2 separate entities here, online school districts, which are part of the regular school district,
Yes.
but they're online, and then online charter schools, and I think there's a little bit of question on the difference here.
So Assemblywoman Baucus has a question.
hopefully I can help my colleagues with an example that I can ask a question on. So one of the online school districts is in Esmeralda. We understand that Esmeralda School District is one of the hold harmless school districts that still receives a per pupil funding at a higher level than what the state average per pupil funding would be. That's my understanding. And with that, there's fewer students. And so the hard part right now is after sitting through listening to Esmeralda's superintendent talking about the struggles with their money, that we're faced with the commission not really addressing the fact that these hold harmless schools sometimes may need the additional funds. And so with that, it's kind of a difficult thing because those smaller school districts have fewer students, and in order to fund it, because it is a school district online program for those students within that school district, they would be receiving currently and under the governor's recommended budget that higher hold harmless amount. And if we decided to follow the commission's recommendation at this time, we would essentially be taking about 2/3 of their funding for like their high school students because that's their only choice. Does that kind of explain, or I mean, my understanding of this unit?
You're correct. Esmeralda does have a virtual high school, and yes, they are on hold harmless. So you raise a valid point and a concern with, how does hold harmless and this providing the statewide amount, how would that interplay with the hold harmless district? I'm not sure the Commission on School Funding considered that, so maybe, additional analysis is needed to kind of see how that interplay and how we would account for that change.
Thank you very much. Additional questions? Okay. With that, I would suggest that the committee recommend no change in online school districts as recommended in the governor's budget. And additionally, the subcommittee would like the Commission on School Funding to consider the impact of those school districts subject to hold harmless in the pupil-centered funding plan when determining whether to adjust what the online school district receives. Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we will go to the Nevada Cost of Education Index. Do we have any questions? Assemblywoman Kasama.
I'm so excited. I can ask my question. Thank you, Chair. Under the Nevada Cost of Education Index here, these indexes were reviewed and calculated. Was there an outside consultant that was used to calculate these indexes?
With my communication with the department, yes. The comparative wage index they use a subject matter expert to determine that, and they would use that subject matter expert to provide that update by the end of April, if required by the subcommittee.
Follow-up? Yes. So with that, one of the decisions to be made at closing is how we're going to handle the education index. Did the subject matter experts provide a recommendation based on what they've seen in other states to do away with that, modify it? Was there any recommendation from them on that?
As far as changing from the ledge approved or prior, anything like that?
Or continuing with it?
I can't speak for the department and any changes or, the discussions they had. I know the department is available if you'd like further, if the chair so wishes, but I cannot speak to what those discussions were.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions on this item? Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned why housing was not included because the opinion was that affluent neighborhoods would get more revenue. But what about rents? Is that not a subset that can be considered? Because rent is different than necessarily a housing price, but it also is a predictor of cost.
I don't know. We can follow up with the department and see if that is something that could be measured and included, or if that has the same issues related to the cost of housing. I just don't know. We'd have to follow up with the department and see.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions? Okay, seeing none, then the recommendation on this particular item would be to apply an index of 1.000 for all counties, eliminating the index as recommended by the Commission on School Funding for the 23-25 biennium. And with that, the second decision would not be applicable or needed. Okay, thank you. We will go on to weighted funding. Any questions on weighted funding? Senator Neal, do I hear you? Oh, we are on page 14, starting on page 14. Okay, you're up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I had questions on it was the ground truth that was mentioned. And so I started trying to look up what ground truth was, and the only thing I could find was that it's an algorithm that is built around clusters of data. And so, we're talking about a couple of things, right? And so do you know what it is?
I admit, this is information provided by the department. It's proprietary information for Infinite Campus that they provided, the calculation. Again, if the chair would like, the department is here, and they have some individuals that maybe could speak to that, but I cannot.
Would the Department of Education like to come up and address that? Good morning, Superintendent and staff. When you are ready, please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Peter Zutz, for the record. I'm the administrator over the Office of Assessment, Data, and Accountability Management. So the product is an Infinite Campus product. Works seamlessly with our existing statewide student information system known as Infinite Campus. The product used to generate the graduation score is called Infinite Campus Analytics. The grad score is a predictor of a student to graduate with their cohort within 5 years, which means beginning the freshman year of a student's matriculation in high school, that is their cohort. As mentioned by Adam, there are approximately 75 measures grouped roughly into 4 categories that he mentioned. I'd be happy to answer any other questions you may have. Thank you.
Senator Neal?
Yes, Madam Chair. So I don't know how to phrase this, but I guess I'm staying consistent because when this was first presented about the Infinite Campus data system and the criteria that was proposed by the governor, which was the academic proficiency, attendance, behavior, and home enrollment stability, I was reading the white paper that Infinite Campus put out. And what they stated was that it wouldn't just be academic proficiency, that also unsatisfactory academic progress that would include retention, demotion, expulsion, or other removal. And also they mentioned measures of a household because those are predictors in an urban, and when we found out Saturday, it's also a predictor in a rural, right? And so I know it's the committee's discussion, but I feel like the factors are not broad enough, and I don't know if that's something that you guys examined or considered. You're nodding that you read the white paper, so you know what's in it. But I think it matters when we're talking about the dollars that are associated with interventions that would flow to what we're determining as an at-risk pupil or other, right?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you for, as always, your individual research. We appreciate. And yes, all of those factors are included. If you wanted, I was waiting possibly for you to state a specific factor that was not included in the 75.
Well, what's not included is, because I don't know what's in the 75, is what I stated in the 75? He's nodding in the back.
I apologize. I do not have the list in front of me, but what she, yes. Yes, it is.
Okay.
For the record, State
Okay.
Superintendent.
Okay, good then. So, Madam Chair, can I have another follow-up?
Please.
So in our notes, it also talked about the training or training for the model. And I guess what came up was who's getting this training, right, in order to run the data outside of you, because this is a drop down to the school. Infinite Campus is by local school precinct. So who's doing the training to make sure that that data is going to be implemented so that the at-risk definition or the 75 factors are correctly applied, identified, monitored, etc.?
Thank you for the question, Superintendent Ebert, for the record. So it's multi-layered, starting with the Department of Education in collaboration with Infinite Campus. That goes, and we have a technical advisory committee that also helps us direct of where needs are. So starting with the department first, working with the school districts and the experts within the school districts, and then they each have identified support within each of the school districts that also provides training, so it's multi-layered across the system.
Just one more follow-up?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the experts in the district, does it trickle down to the school site having experts who are then going to extrapolate and monitor? Because the white paper was heavy on counselors. We know our counselors are overloaded in the urban school district. So who else does it pass to in the school site to make sure that the at-risk pupil is getting the right intervention, the right supports that are being funded?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you for the question. At the state level, we provide the district support as each individual school district. You know, we have the fifth largest, and then Esmeralda, who testified here the other day. So when you compare those two, in Esmeralda, it actually is individual teachers. We can get all of them when we work in one room. In a larger urban school district, it is incumbent upon the school district and the trainers there to support the educators. I will tell you that I have witnessed professional development, you know, at the school district level with the teachers and with counselors or specific groups that if there are any updates or changes that are transpiring within the system, that those groups are brought together to make sure that they're aware of those changes.
Thank you for that, because I just wanted to ask about, because, you know, I kind of went in a circle, because if ground truth is dependent upon these clusters, it's also dependent upon the action related to the cluster and the dollars appropriated to the cluster that we're saying 0.30 is going to be applied to, right? And so that's why I wanted to I went just a little deep, but thank you, Madam Chair, because I needed to understand for myself.
Okay, additional questions? Assemblywoman Monroe-Marie? Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, and so looking at the numbers for free and reduced lunch during COVID, we had a situation where a lot of schools, if you had a certain percentage, all those students were eligible for free and reduced lunch at the entire school. So what do you think the normal number of pupils who would be eligible will be for free and reduced lunch? Because I know sometimes that's used as a sort of a poverty factor, a low income factor. But when I look at this at 1819, it's 300,000 and it's 326. Then, you know, obviously we're like almost 400,000 now. So what do you anticipate being the level, the new level.
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you, Senator, for the question. That the reason why you hear the pause is because the federal government has made available in recent years the community eligibility program. So we've used Churchill as an example, and I know Dr. Stevens, Superintendent Stevens, testified on Saturday. And as I was watching, I think she did a really good job because her school district is identified 100% free and reduced lunch because of the community eligibility program. They would need to, or we would need to work with other factors such as SNAP and, to drill down on the best we can number because there are those other factors. As she testified on Saturday, the at-risk, it's not 100% of our students that are at risk. But when we run the model, she shared that she felt it captured most of those students that would not graduate with their typical peers. So I would be giving you a guesstimate of percentage-wise at this point. What I would recommend is that if this body wanted to look at other factors, like SNAP, that those are data points that we could pull together outside of just the identification for free and reduced lunch for children.
Thank you. So I was not aware of the community eligibility program, so that means like an entire county could become eligible. And so those numbers could really shift over time because the programs and the eligibility changes. So we wouldn't have maybe 300, 320. We could have 700,000 kids potentially. I'm just throwing that out there, but like literally 100%. Okay. All right. So that's my one question. And then when I'm looking at the weighted, there's been some conversations about like the weights and who's counted in the weights. But when I look at this, the numbers that individuals counted in the weights has changed, but so have the weights. So when we look at English language learners, in 23, it was 0.23%, and now it's recommended to be 0.5, right? It's doubling, and you look at risk, it went from 0.03 to 0.30. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on, was there a calculation where you sort of backed into how you could weight that based on how much you wanted to put in those programs or what you thought was right? Like you thought potentially 4,300 was more appropriate for English language learners versus $1,600, and did you back into the weights based on what you wanted to do per pupil because that's what you thought you needed for that type of student?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you for the question, Senator. As we shifted from the Nevada plan to the pupil-centered funding plan, what we did for the weight, so let me back up. All of the research over the last few decades we used to create the weights. And that was also confirmed with the Commission on School Funding. So ELL has always been 0.5 to fund at that level. That has been the recommended level from day one, 0.5. That's not a new recommendation. It has always been the recommendation. What we did as a state was, because we could not fund it 100% and we were making the transition, we used the Zoom dollars that were made available within the state and then placed those into that weight. So it only funded at 0.03. Thank you. We took the dollars that were already being used for that type of activity, and then that was funded at 0.03. So we did back into the formula for the dollars that were made available at that point in time.
Thank you. And when I'm looking at this, if I can follow up, so that the English language learner actually sort of balances. You have the same number of students, but you doubled the weight because you were able to do that. But then I look at risk, the weight went from 0.3 to 30, but you have like maybe 28% of the students that we used to have as far as the head count, projected number of students. And that's because of the change in the model. Right. And so if we switch to like a free and reduced lunch model, instead of 63,000 students, potentially it's like almost 400,000 students using today's numbers?
Superintendent Ebert, that is correct. If you just use free and reduced lunch, which is inclusive of the community eligibility program, it inflates those numbers. And so we are recommending that the information that we have on those students that are most likely not to earn their diploma be identified as those students that are at risk and fund those students.
Last question. So in that the at-risk calculation that we have right now, you said there's 75 different factors, and you keep talking about like graduating or completing, right? But what about the literacy issues, the read by third grade? So the students who are struggling at the very beginning, because you change the trajectory if you change that. So are you factoring that in to make sure that when you have the earliest learners, they're recognized that their potential to graduate is very low, so you're factoring literacy?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, yes, their academic achievement at our earliest grades is included in this.
Thank
And
you.
if they are not proficient, then they are included as all the other indicators with at risk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman Miller.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a quick question on the gifted and talented calculation. I noticed that there's about 400 students less in 24-25 than from 23. And I'm just curious, was there a different calculation used to determine also the gifted and talented students?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, we use the same definition year over year.
Okay, so it's just, do we have an idea of why we project that there just be such a significant difference from 23 to 24?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, school districts, school districts providing support and services for gifted and talented students, their ability to provide those services changes year over year, and so that they report up on the number of gifted and talented students that they're serving.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your answers. I believe we have no more questions, and so if we could have fiscal staff back up, I will try to put some clarification to this. And with that, I would say that the subcommittee would recommend 1A, approving the governor's recommendation to identify at-risk pupils using the grad score calculated from the Infinite Campus Student Data System. Also, the subcommittee would recommend to approve an alternate weighted funding level for English learner pupils, at-risk pupils, and gifted and talented pupils. And specifically, the ELL weight would be 0.45, and the at-risk weight would be 0.35. And I believe Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno has a question on this.
It wasn't a question, I more of a statement. Well, during the hearing, the initial hearing, there was a lot of conversation about at-risk students and how we felt the numbers didn't jive. And I think there's still some work to be done with Infinite Campus, so we're all comfortable with how the weights are listed. Going back to what the chair just said with the English learner being the highest weighted, and the conversations that we've had this whole legislative session about at risk, I agree with you that I think it would be good to have an alternative to the weights. We haven't even discussed special education, but hearing the conversations from the superintendents, from constituents, from the department, a lot of those students that would have been included in at risk, I think, are probably oftentimes also special education students. So I would agree with the chair in having an alternative to the weights and lowering the English learner to the 0.45 as you suggested, raising the the weight on at-risk to 0.35 and leaving our gifted and talented students weight at where it is. And then we'll have much more work to do on how we determine what those at-risk students are, but continue working on that for future legislative bodies. Yeah, that's.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, hang on, just one second. With that, we would also recommend allowing the weighted enrollment counts to be updated in the fiscal year 25 using October 1st, 2023 enrollment counts to be consistent as done in the past. And now I will go to Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just doing some quick math, it looks like if you were to change those weightings, the English language learners, 5% is about $430 per student, so 5% is $430. So English language learners would go down by about 22.6 million, and at-risk would go up by about 27.2 million total. So this shift is really around $430 per student.
We would have to take a look and see what the final numbers were and any other changes that are made. But at this point, I mean, that seems somewhat reasonable.
Right. So if you take the 85.96 and you multiply it by 5%, you'll get at $429 roughly. Okay. Thank you.
Speaker Yeager, question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and not really a question, but just wanted to, I guess, repeat what Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno said. We've had so much discussion about at-risk in this committee and the fact that understand the change in the definition, but the net effect is a reduction of at-risk students by a pretty significant amount. I think it was about 75%. But I just wanted to say that I support increasing the at-risk weight, and especially given what this committee heard on Saturday from this committee and other folks heard on Saturday from some of the superintendents just about what I think were undoubtedly at-risk students with real challenges relating to poverty coming into school. And I think we're probably going to hear that tonight in tonight's hearing as well from the larger districts. So I just want to say I appreciate the work in trying to get this definition right. And I think for now, increasing that weight certainly is something the committee should advance and support when we get to that point. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Additional comments? Okay, with that, we will go on to.
Madam Chair, may
Oh,
I just ask
sorry.
for clarification on that final
Yes,
item?
please.
So the recommendation is to allow the department to update their second year weighted enrollment count for FY25 using October 1st, 2023. As far as the funding source, if that increases, did you want to provide a reserve or just utilize the education stabilization account if needed?
I believe that we want to be consistent with the ESA.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we will move to the account for state special education services. Are there any questions on this account? Yes, ma'am. Page 17. Go ahead, please, Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, in looking at, you know, towards the end, what we know is that we have districts that have hold harmless, and then we know we've got charters who actually are below because they have rising enrollment. And when you divide by their count, right, the same amount of money divided by their count, so they're falling behind by several $1 million. And so when I was looking at the options, the scenario A, B, C, and D, the way that these are all written is that the school districts at the same time as the charter schools and the University for Gifted and Talented, those all go up or down. But so if you just do that, you always leave the charters behind because you're sort of raising the bar, which helps everyone, right? But they never get equal funding. So I didn't know if you had looked at a scenario where you provide the gap funding and then you look at raising or lowering it if you choose to do that. So what's the gap funding to catch charters up to the average dollar for all of the other schools?
Thank you for the question, Madison Ryan, LCB Fiscal. Madam Chair, through you to Senator Severs-Gansert. So the four scenarios, scenario A, B, C, and D, that funding would just be provided to those school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils that are under that statewide average. So that funding is just going to those local educational agencies. So it wouldn't be for all school districts, charter schools, and the university school for profoundly gifted pupils. It's just for those under that statewide average. So scenario A is specifically bringing those local educational agencies up to the statewide average. Scenario B would be providing at least the English learner per pupil amount, and that funding would just be for the charter school authority, I think Clark County, and the university school for profoundly gifted pupils.
So kind of circling back, so I get this clear. So A is the gap funding. That is catching them up, and does that include those that are within the state charter school district as well as the charters that are within school districts? Because there's two kinds of charters, and sometimes they're
Through you to Senator Severs-Gansert. So when calculating the special education funding, the school district-sponsored charter schools are accounted for in the school district, while the state public charter school authority-sponsored charter schools are a separate line item per se in the payment workbook when that funding is distributed to school districts and state public charter school authority-sponsored charter schools.
Thank you. So is there a requirement within school districts that they provide the same level of funding for the charter school students as students in other schools?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question,
Thank you.
please?
So this looks like it catches up the funding for those that are in the state-sponsored charter schools. The other ones are within the school districts, and there still may be inequity there because they have charters that are growing within their school districts. So is there a requirement that those that are within school districts, that they have the same average funding for special ed children as those schools that are not charters within a school district?
We're not aware of anything like that. I think that's a district decision, so.
Okay, thank you. And then in looking at B, C, D, do all those numbers include the catch-up plus the increase? So everyone would be at parity. If you're a charter school or you're a regular school district, public school, they all would be at these levels. So you're catching them up at the same time.
Thank you for the question, Madison Ryan, LCB Fiscal. For the record, Madam Chair, through you to Senator Severs-Gansert. Yes, that would be correct. So it would just be going to those that are below the statewide average.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we would recommend approval of the governor's recommended funding and additional general fund appropriations as provided for in scenario B, noted for the state special education program to provide a minimum level of state special education funding either on a per pupil or weighted basis for each school district, charter school, and the university school for the profoundly gifted. And in addition, recommending reducing the weighted multiplier for English learner pupils in the pupil-centered funding plan that is currently being recommended by the governor and as previously recommended in the last decision. Does that make that clear for you? If not, you are welcome to clarify. Thank you very much. Yes, Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we go to close this budget, I would like us to consider whether we require or have language in the budget that requires school districts to make sure that the charter schools within the districts, so charter districts sponsored by school districts, have equal funding per pupil. I'd like us to be able to consider that too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we will go to the balancing expenditures to revenue in the updated pupil-centered funding plan. I don't know that I.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know, that's because I'm still thinking. There's just a lot of moving pieces, so I'm not sure what the best approach is to balance this. And I don't think I understand if there's different means of balancing, or you have to balance anyway, because you have to take the suggestions that we just had and figure out what that means, which should be sort of an automatic. So I don't know if there's a decision point here or not. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Adam Drost, Fiscal Analysis Division for the record. So again, this is the first time we're balancing this model, so there may be some unknowns. But at this point, based on the decisions of the subcommittee, what I would maybe suggest for consideration is that we're going to have additional revenue that this legislature has already considered. There will be updated enrollment, possible changes in revenue. Maybe the subcommittee could provide us with direction that the governor's recommended statewide base amount be maintained at a minimum, a 0.45 EL weight be provided, a 0.35 at-risk weight be provided for at-risk, a 0.12 weight be provided for gifted and talented students, and then, if additional funding remains, the governor's recommended statewide base amount would increase accordingly to use that additional revenue, which would of course require those weights to also increase to maintain those weights that I just mentioned. So maybe those are guardrails that could be provided to staff to balance this model.
That's right on the money. No pun intended. Thank you. Senator Gansert?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so if you have extra dollars, then you're suggesting that that rolls into the weights instead of into the base?
What I would suggest is you maintain those weights that you have already discussed, and then if additional funding remains, you go back to the base, increase that, which would also require additional money for the weights to maintain that parity.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions or comments? Thank you very much. And so with that, the recommendation from this committee would be for fiscal staff to balance that pupil-centered funding plan model when various updates are provided in the subcommittee when the budget is closed in May 2023, and asking you as fiscal staff to utilize this remaining funding to first adjust the weights for English learners, at-risk, and gifted and talented pupils to ensure they are as reasonably similar to the governor's recommended weights as possible. If additional funding remains, it could be used to adjust the statewide base per pupil amount while maintaining the governor's recommended weights to utilize any residual funding. Would you like to repeat that? Or is that clear?
I think I'm clear. I would just ask the ability to transfer general fund between fiscal years, not necessarily increasing but if needed, but transferring gov recommended general fund appropriations between fiscal years, just because, that balance forward, the additional net proceeds of minerals, we may need to kind of have some smoothing mechanism between the fiscal years. So I would just ask for that authority.
Yes, sir. And remembering that we have the new weights of 0.45, the at-risk would be 0.35, and the gifted and talented remains at 0.12. Senator Gansert?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to ask so many questions. You're going to plus everything up, but I would also like to know what that number is that's going to be used, because we know we've got a number of bills that affect education. For instance, the one to provide matching dollars for salary increases for licensed personnel, which I think is $250 million, like a $250 million block grant. So it'd be good to know what's left over after these recommended decisions that you right now will be using to plus everything up. So we kind of need to know what that balance is, I think. So then we'll have a choice whether we want to plus up everything or whether we want to use some of those funds for other purposes.
Madam Chair, through you, Senator, just to clarify, are you speaking of general fund appropriations or
No, so what I'm trying to figure out is we have the recommended budget and we've made some recommendations as far as how we think we may end up closing. And if there's money left over, which I believe there will be because we've got the $321 million that's going to be rolling forward that we didn't have before. If we can know based on the decisions we have now, what do we look like at that point in time? And then what's the number that will be used potentially to plus up the PCPF and the risk, the different weights. I just want to know what that is. Thank you.
Sure. Madam Chair, through you to the Senator. So I think fiscal's plan would be to, balance the model, have all these decisions, show those updated revenue, and then provide that to the subcommittee. So you would see kind of the end result of these decisions at that point with the subcommittee closing.
Thank you. And the delta, that number, if we have $300 million that was used to plus up everything, if that, whatever that number is.
Those
Thank
changes,
you.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions or comments? Okay, I think we're at the end of that particular budget discussion. And so with that, we will move to our last item, which is public comment. And I would like to give you the number. The dial-in number is 888-475-4499. When prompted for the meeting ID, it is 830-9101-6445, and then press pound. When prompted for participant ID, please press pound. I will begin here with public comment in Carson City. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Sarah Adler with Silver State Government Relations, and I am proud to represent a small handful of charter schools that are based in Washoe County. So just a few points I'd like to make. I want to share with you the historic, and it relates to transportation funding decisions. In the historic model of funding in the Nevada plan, the way charters made it all work is they did receive transportation and nutrition funding that they didn't always use for transportation, and that's kind of how they paid rent. So the shift to the pupil-centered funding plan is magnificent, except for it took that flexibility out of their budget. Now, my charters are glad that you didn't fund transportation because they need every dollar into the pupil-centered funding plan. And a dollar that you might spend on a bus today, you get that done, but you need that dollar somewhere else the next day. So they're okay with your transportation decision today. But an interesting decision you made today is that online district schools get the enriched amount of the adjusted funding and online charter schools the base amount. What happened is that enriched funding for online district charter schools goes pretty much to the district level, and they get to use that to have the district float. When district-sponsored charters, at least in Washoe County, don't get that attendance area adjustment, so they don't have that enrichment that you continue to provide through your online funding decision today. That's not huge, but that's something. On the at-risk definition, we wonder why Title I school designation has not been a consideration for how you decide who is at risk, because the free and reduced lunch with community eligibility, which is a fantastic thing, it feeds kids. So if FRL doesn't work as well, but at risk maybe would. And our schools really, really are concerned about that funding recognition of the need for funding at the primary school level, because they feel proficiency in your basic skills is what's really going to propel you to graduation. So just those remarks. Big new idea on EL funding. Right now, your EL funding stops when your child passes the WIDA exam, but really they need 2 or 3 more years of support for that child to maintain in proficiency. So in future biennium, maybe we consider an EL slope, not an EL cliff. And then the issues you raised, Senator Gansert, about districts passing through, for example, SPED funds to their district-sponsored charters, that is a big discussion about a variety of types of funds. Fortunately, we are meeting with Washoe County on April 7th to try and address those issues, but you're right on. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anyone else here in Carson City? Not seeing anyone, we will go to Las Vegas. Not seeing anyone in Las Vegas, we will go to the phone lines. BPS, when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. The public lines are open and working. However, there are no callers to offer public comment at this time.
All right. Well, it's a quiet group today. Thank you very much. And thank you, BPS and subcommittee members. This completes our business for today. I hope you all have a good rest of the day. As a reminder, we'll reconvene in a joint meeting of Senate Finance and Assembly Ways and Means at 4 o'clock this afternoon in room 4100. This meeting is adjourned.